Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Sirius Report. My name is Ken Shorjan, and as always, I'm here with Paul. And Paul has an interesting query we have to take a look at. Why is President Trump so desperate to end the war in Ukraine? And it's not for the reasons that most people think. Paul, as always, I want to thank you for being a part of the discussion. And this is something that you brought up with me in our talks before we got on. And I think it's vastly important because really it could lay the foundations of where not just the Ukraine conflict goes, but what decisions President Trump has to make or may end up biting him in the butt, depending on what his choices are.
Yeah, well, welcome as well, Ken. Pleasure as ever that we get together. And yeah, this is the question, why does he want to get it over with? But as much as anything, like post haste, he keeps going on. Things have to happen quickly. Everything's yesterday, not tomorrow, next week, in a timely manner that actually is befitting of resolving a 3-year conflict. And people will naturally believe it's, well, why wouldn't he want to get a war over quickly? Surely it's obvious he wants peace. He wants, the Ukraine war to be resolved. Well, yes, absolutely. But that is only a small sort of side issue almost to the myriad of other reasons why he wants the war over. And I think that's why we thought it was a good idea to discuss this and go through all the points and realize it is a domestic issue, it's a Ukrainian issue, and it also is an international issue. And it's an international issue with respect to its notional allies, and also an international issue with respect to his adversaries, in inverted commas. And we'll go through each point, and then this will highlight why we keep making the observation that the world is an immensely complicated place. It's convoluted, and there are no simple answers, or the world operates in a way people imagine it does, because it doesn't. And that's one of the biggest failings of the alt media. It had a chance to tell people what the world really operates like, and instead it chose to have this very simplistic idea that the world revolves around things that in fact in reality it doesn't. And we hope by discussing this with respect to Ukraine and the United States that it will give some insight into why Trump's in this position where he wants to end the war quickly, but in trying to do so he actually risks the war escalating and the war carrying on. And also he risks, as a result of this, causing a myriad of problems domestically and internationally, such as we said, the complexity and the convoluted nature of global geopolitics. So I think the first point to start with, isn't it, probably sounds like an obvious statement, but the reality is Trump has no real idea what's going on in Ukraine. Currently, I think increasingly in the last few weeks, he's beginning to have a better understanding. I think the US military and intelligence agencies are now actually starting to give the current administration a clearer indication of what's going on. And I think in some senses, that is what also accelerated the idea in the mindset of the US to get this war over, because they do understand the longer this war goes on, the weaker the position of Ukraine becomes, the weaker the position of the West becomes, and the more, if you like, the United States looks ineffective, weak, and incapable of being a major geopolitical player on the world stage. Because hence why, well, if we can solve this problem overnight, then I look like I'm the guy who stopped the war. It's the United States who's back on track. We're dictating global geopolitical decisions. I mean, look at the Western media trying to make out Putin had caved in, and MAGA showed they were back with force, and none of it was true. And this is all part of this posturing to give the impression that the United States is and still is an hegemonic power, which it isn't. And of course, the bit of background to this was Trump made these election promises, and no doubt he did it because it would have been a vote winner, and a lot of people would have voted for Trump on the basis that he said, I will end the Ukraine war in 24 hours, which, of course, anybody who understood reality knew this was absolute nonsense. And, of course, many 24 hours have been and gone, and it's not happened. I mean, so therefore, there's an element of desperation creeping in because deadline after deadline came and went. I think the feeling in the Oval Office when Zelensky turned up, this is a turning point. Zelensky's going to sign this minerals agreement, and then it's the next step towards a peace process. We look like we're in charge. We look like we're the dominant global power, and everyone's going to be happy at home because I kept my election promise. And of course, it failed spectacularly. So then we came to the meeting between the United States and Ukrainian officials, minus Zelensky, in Riyadh recently. And the turnaround was spectacular. I mean, it showed the United States was both irrelevant, incompetent, incapable, and in no way, shape, or form was able to deal with this really difficult problem that was spiraling out of control. So what did they do after 7 hours of talks? They came out and went, well, this is our answer. We're going to have a ceasefire for 30 days. And because the Ukrainians have agreed to it, even though there's no detail on this ceasefire, and it remains to be seen if when the details of a ceasefire ever came into existence, which at the moment is never going to happen, the Ukrainians would walk away from it anyway. In a way, it was to appease the Ukrainians so they didn't do another Oval Office debacle with Vance and Trump tearing strips off Zelensky. Okay, Zelensky wasn't there. I mean, but this get out clause that the US thought, well, we'll make this happen, then the Russians will just agree because we're the dominant global power, even though they're not. They'll have to do as they're told. And then we can say, see, we stopped the war. Look, we are this hegemonic power. We have achieved these objectives. And then we can walk away and leave these powers to go and, slug it out in terms of the diplomacy to end the war. And we can say our job's done. We did what we said we'd do. We stopped the war. And I think all along, that was what the Trump thought he would do by ending the war in 24 hours. He thought he was going to tell them, have a ceasefire, and everyone would capitulate because Ukraine can't keep fighting the war. But then, of course, misguided by Russia's position, and we're back to the very first point that the United States has little or no idea what's going on. And they went, well, they can't fight either, so they'll both, through exhaustion and just totally demoralized, they'll end the war. Of course, none of this happened. So I think, for me, that's the starting point. And they are very powerful reasons why the US wants out of this. And thus far, of course, that's failed to materialize. And as we said previously, Putin's indifference and shopping list he gave to Witkoff, which is basically, you have to satisfy all these criteria for us to even consider that. And what he's basically asking the US to consider is not a ceasefire anymore. It's exactly what Russia wanted in the first place, which was a lasting peace agreement.
Yeah, and I think we definitely have to emphasize from the very beginning, Trump did not create this. He inherited all this. He inherited what was going on in the Middle East, West Asia. He inherited what was going on with the Ukraine conflict. He inherited the disconnect between NATO and all these Eastern European Chihuahua countries what they want as opposed to what the United States as a whole wants. I think also Trump had a number of successes in his first term. He walked, him and Kim Jong Un stood in North Korean territory. He was able to pretty much eradicate ISIS, at least get, tamp them down. He was able to dictate to Afghanistan the terms of the withdrawal, et cetera, et cetera. He had a lot of successes. And I think because of that, he came in office thinking, all I've got to do is do the exact same thing, and the world's just going to capitulate. Well, no. The problem is that he came into a conflict that was well underway into up to the point of war. Ukraine may be an SMO, but for all intents and purposes, it is an all-out war between, whether it's proxy war or what Russia wants to achieve. We have Israel and Palestine and all the other regional countries that are involved and have fired missiles and armaments in there. That is a conflict. You can't just sit there and just snap your fingers and think it's going to stop overnight or declare a ceasefire as such. And I think President Trump, because of how quickly his successes were in his first term, he thought he'd go in and do the same thing, and he's finding out the hard way that the world doesn't work that way anymore.
Yeah, absolutely. And then we come on to the problem that if they don't end this conflict quickly, then the US, because they made the mistake of saying, well, now that you've agreed to a ceasefire, Ukraine will continue to arm you and provide you with intelligence. And no doubt this will involve financing. The problem is he then effectively starts to own the war he doesn't want to own, because he then it's his war and he will have to face the repercussions of that. But also here's the big problem with the financing and the military hardware. Does the US have anything to give? And that probably not. Also, we know how expensive Ukraine has become. This will blow the US's budget in supporting Ukraine. When he's going around going, we're slashing the budget, and suddenly there's line items for enormous amounts of money to keep the war going. And the problem is they kind of have to do this because if they don't, then the US looks like it's weak. It looks like it can't defend any nation on this planet, basically. It sends the completely wrong message to the other NATO countries. It would totally undermine NATO. Now, whether the US wants NATO to end is debatable. I don't think they do, because they're really concerned what Europe might do. They'd rather have Europe stumping all the costs and the US spends very little. But again, it comes to finance. So the financing and military hardware angle, which the US is now rapidly signing up to again, is a massive headache. So that's another reason why you'd want the war over, so you don't have to face that very difficult situation with respect to financing and military hardware. And I think, for me, that's an extremely important point to make, and it often gets lost in the broader understanding of, the US is trying to become more responsible with Doge, etc. And then it goes, oh, sorry, we've just blown another 20, 30, whatever, 50 billion in supporting a war we said we were going to end. I mean, this politically causes Trump a lot of damage. And if the military stands there and goes, we've got nothing to give, then it makes the US military look extremely weak. And let's face it, they've hardly looked strong in this Ukraine war when the endless game changers they've already sent have all amounted to precisely nothing. So for me, that's another pressing issue, and it's a big problem to deal and manage.
Yeah, very much so. And that echoes what Hegseth said just yesterday. Not only is the U.S. military soldier not up to standards, whether it's obesity, whether it's mental, whether it's the capacity to do war, but also he intimated that the United States does not have the proper supplies, materials, or weapons to be able to conduct any conflict. So he didn't come out and just say we have nothing anymore, but pretty much it was inferring that we ourselves are not in a position to be able to function as a military capacity anywhere in the world. So, if you don't have your military at that capacity and you are stuck playing, uh, what's a better like the word, not mediator, but integrator to all these different conflicts, and your real goal is to eventually pivot towards the Arctic, pivot towards making this Iron Dome, pivot more towards the Monroe Doctrine, going back to the North America, pivot towards China and dealing with that, or Iran even. Things, if you're stuck with all these other conflicts that you are being pulled every single day to have to deal with and worry about, then it's something you mentioned in a podcast a couple days ago, is that Trump is going to find himself stuck in this mire for another 2 years, and then the midterms come, and if he loses his popular support and people stop believing the rhetoric that he's putting out there, then he's going to find himself a lame duck going into the final 2 years, and it's going to be all for naught.
Yeah, absolutely. And to be honest, the internal politics might be also within the Beltway. I mean, if this goes horribly wrong, the US gets sucked into this, then he's going to lose a lot of support the Beltway currently gives him, clearly, that Wall Street gives him. I mean, he could have enormous problem, not just with the US electorate, but the entire apparatus that support the president. This is why this time around Trump's not having the resistance he did, because that's all changed. But, if in politics, if someone starts to look like a loser, they'll throw them under the bus very rapidly. So they're enormous problem. And then, there was also this whole mineral deal, which was supposed to be signed and sealed in the Oval Office. That didn't happen. It was supposed to be signed again. It failed to materialize. Now it's gone very quiet, and they're almost going, well, we'll have to come to some agreement about this, as though, well, what were you going to sign in the Oval Office if you didn't have an agreement? So why is it such a pressing need to sign that? Because again, this is the US going, well, that's part of our deal. We've signed that. We'll get our money back. Tell the American people we're going to get it back. And in the process, we stop the war. So look, we've got all our money back, or we're going to in the future, which of course is nonsense, because the mineral deal isn't worth the paper it's written on. But that's gone very quiet. No one's talking about it. So that, again, is a huge problem. And another reason why Trump goes, well, I need this war over rapidly. I need this deal signed. It's not happening. So that's a big problem. And then we come on to the theater of conflict. And Kursk is an obvious example. Now, it's a statement of the obvious that all prisoners of war should be treated under the basis of a Geneva Convention. So why did Trump suddenly talk about the risk of Ukrainians being, because they're being surrounded, there's supposed to be 10,000 of them in Kursk, going, well, I hope you're going to look after them properly, to Putin? I mean, that's a bizarre statement, because Putin will come back, of course, and say, well, if they surrender, yes, they'll be prisoners of war and treated correctly under the Geneva Convention. Okay, people will disagree, but that's his statement. As opposed to the fact he said if they carry on fighting, then they're a legitimate target. Why is Trump saying it about Kursk? Why are they panicking about Kursk? And that's another reason they want the war over quickly, because the optics out of Kursk, if the Ukrainians are kicked out, is going to look horrendous. So what they're trying to also do in the process now is damage limitation across the board. I think also what you'll find is a lot of those forces in Kursk are Western mercenaries, and the Russians have hinted at that. They said there's British there, French there, Germans, whoever else. Maybe it's, I don't know, 10%, could be 50%. That is going to look really bad for the West. So again, it's like, get the war over. They were hoping, let's have a ceasefire. And this is why Putin said, well, if there's a ceasefire, what happens to these forces we've surrounded? Are they going to be allowed to just leave? Well, again, this is another reason, get the ceasefire in place, and then we'll smuggle these mercenaries out, because if we don't, and they're paraded all over Russian television, we're in big trouble. And so that's another reason also, because of the encroachment in Dnipro. For the first time, and Russia may try and take that region, and they're moving into Sumy over the border from Kursk and Kharkov. So that's another reason. The optics are deteriorating. So we must end this war yesterday. And Russia keeps making advances that's making their position stronger. And it's making the West more vulnerable. It's making Ukraine more vulnerable. And it's making this desperation for a ceasefire look more and more transparent. It's very clear Russia sees that, but it's a huge problem. And it's another part of this whole equation why Trump wants the war over now. And it's not just because he wants to save lives and have peace. There are ulterior motives, and this is another one of those.
No, I very much agree. And I think you hit the nail on the head is Trump is trying to, in my opinion, have his cake and eat it too. He's trying to appease all sides while also trying to protect himself politically in this. Obviously, he spent his entire first term being called a Russian puppet. There was Russiagate. There was all this other things. But the reality is if he gets good information and knew that the U.S. was involved in the start of this whole thing back in 2014, the Maidan coup, and the U.S. has been helping pump it, this proxy war and these attacks and conflagrations onto Russia and the ethnic Russians in there, then he would know that Kiev cannot be trusted, and he would have to choose a side. And choosing the side of standing with Russia, cutting off arms, cutting off anything, ordering Europe to pretty much stand down, would then end the conflict overnight. That's how you resolve it. That's laid out for him, but he's choosing not to do it. And I don't know exactly why, whether it's bad information or he's trying to act tough to the Beltway that he's not a Russian puppet. But if you're going to integrate what you want, you're going to have to get this conflict over extraordinarily quickly. And it's already been proven. I mean, just take a look at what happened yesterday. Witkoff was in Moscow trying to talk about the ceasefire and get Russia to sign on board. At the exact same time Witkoff is in Moscow, Kiev sends another drone attack into Moscow. So the Russians are sitting going, we can't trust them. If there's a ceasefire, they're not going to hold to it. So why am I going to sign anything with you? And, he had to pretty much go back to Trump, and he's not going to get anything he wants. The reality is there's one trustworthy side, and there's one that is, unless they have elections, they're not going to be adherent to whatever ceasefire or peace agreement is ever put. So he's stuck between a rock and a hard place, and he's got to make the tough choices, except bite the political bullet of siding with Russia, or you know what, this thing is going to go on for another 9 months plus, and he's going to be unable to do all the things that he wants to do in pivoting to points around the world.
Well, it could as well, Ken, the last 9 weeks. I mean, no one's got anything to fight the war. But anyway, a couple of other points. I mean, is they want the war over the Americans because they just have no idea what nonsense the Europeans are going to come out with. Okay, it's all hot air mainly, and logically it will be, but they could make stupid decision. They're not going to go to war with Russia or anything ridiculous like that, but they could do something that completely upends any chance of any end to the war, because the Russians will just use it as an excuse to go, well, that's their attitude. I mean, there was talk that the Europeans said, well, if there's a ceasefire, we're going to continue arming Ukraine. Now, the reality is they're not going to do this. What are they going to arm with? And B, the Americans will go, what are you playing at? But then the Russians go, well, there's no point having a ceasefire there. So they totally undermine the Americans. So words alone can cause massive damage. So another reason, get the war over before the Europeans stick the proverbial, boot in their own mouth. The other point that's worth making is international issues. Everyone knows the United States can only manage one crisis or conflict at a time. They're itching to get Iran back under some vague JCPOA agreement. We talked about this in another podcast, which is coming out later on, well, probably early next week. So we'll park that, but that is an ongoing issue. And then there's the whole issue of China. So the US wants Ukraine done and dusted so they can move on to other issues because they can't cope with managing one or two, and certainly not three. So therefore, that's another reason why they want the war over ASAP. And there are some of the most fundamental reasons why this is way more complicated. It involves way more players. And it's not just simply a question of, well, I want peace in the world. And I want peace and to break out. We want it to happen yesterday. The US has many, many reasons. And in the process of trying to deal with those many reasons, they risk actually escalating it and actually handing the initiative even more to the Russians. But also domestically, Trump risks huge internal problems from all angles if he gets this wrong. And the US then now looks like the Trump administration owns the war. And if they do, and then in a matter of weeks or months, Ukraine completely capitulates, can you imagine the geopolitical fallout of that? I mean, they're going to be lining up in the Beltway to go, well, this is a useless leader. He caused us huge political embarrassment, geopolitical embarrassment. He's made our military look useless. He's made our intelligence agencies look useless. This would be absolutely devastating for him. And this is why they want the war over yesterday. And why Trump keeps going, it has to happen quickly. Has to happen quickly. Well, these are the reasons why.
I think one final point I'm going to make is Trump is also putting himself to make the United States look weak to other European nations, especially NATO nations. If he can get the conflict over in Ukraine, then the European leaders are suddenly going to go, well, we can't, he's got this power, he's got this gravitas, we can't really oppose him. But if it tries to do the ceasefire and it extends on and on and on, and nothing really gets accomplished, and there's deceptions from both sides or going through, then the NATO countries in Europe is going to continue to see Trump as extraordinarily weak, and they're going to push themselves to be independent and to do things that the United States isn't mandating or dictating. So he's got the very good chance over Ukraine to also lose control over Europe and European leaders and what they decide to do. And in the end, the United States just becomes the paper tiger that nobody's really going to pay attention to. Anyway, Paul, were there any final points or did you get it covered?
That's plenty.
Absolutely. As always, thank you very much for your insights and for being a part of this discussion.
Yes, and likewise.
And to everybody here in the Sirius Report community, thank you as well for all of your support. Don't forget to like, share, subscribe, comment, send this out to anybody you think it might be important to. And until the next time we get together, have a great day.